Lovely. Well, hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here, please be sure to hit that subscribe button and the little bell, of course, so you get your notifications and get that notification about when I have another wonderful interview with another wonderful writer. And I can't wait to introduce you to today's novelist, who is Pamela Gwyn Kripke, which is a really fab name. I don't know if I'm saying it right, but Kripke. She's come to fiction after a very successful career in journalism, having written for the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, the Huffington Post, and many, many more. But her career began as a television reporter in Biloxi, Mississippi, and she's held magazine editorships in New York and in Dallas and elsewhere. And Pamela's short stories have appeared or are forthcoming in Folio, the Woven Tale Press, the Barcelona Review, the Concrete Desert Review, and Doubleback Review, and that's just to name a few. So well published. But At the Seams, which we're talking about today, that is Pamela's first novel, and she currently lives near Philadelphia and has 2 daughters. So welcome, Pamela. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so nice to be here.
Well, no, I'm really excited to talk about your novel because there's lots of interesting aspects to it, which we'll come to in time. But I'd love to know, first of all, just a little bit more about how having had that very successful career or having a successful career in journalism, what sort of made you want to shift out of nonfiction and make that move into fiction?
Well, it's interesting because my career in journalism has had its own path. So starting out with television and then moving over to magazines and writing long reported feature stories. Um, and having a really successful freelance career writing for all kinds of publications. When I lived in Dallas, I went back to my roots a little bit and covered breaking news. And I was a freelance reporter for the New York Times covering breaking news in Texas. So I was able to keep that aspect of my journalism really sharp, going out and covering and reporting. So while I was doing that, well, actually, before that, I wrote an essay for the Chicago Tribune. And I sort of caught the essay bug. And the thing about writing essays, as you know, is they're true. They're based on your observations. They're fact, but you get to tell them as a story. So if the essays weren't true, they would read a little bit like a short story. So I've always written essays. And I think that the essay form was my connection between nonfiction and fiction.
Mhm.
And I've always written them and had them published widely and love writing them. And I was a syndicated columnist for a while back in the early 2000s. During the pandemic, I started to write short stories. And coming from a journalism background, I find, and this is something I'm trying to work on, that I need the truth, the kernel of truth to begin.
Okay.
So um, I sort of started with something that happened, and then felt the freedom to branch out and turn it into fiction. And so from that, I thought, well, maybe I can make a longer short story and call it a novel. And so that's how that all happened.
Oh, it's been it's nice that you're able to recognize that that kernel of truth that needs to be at the heart of whatever you're writing, whether it be your nonfiction, an essay, a short story, or even a novel, that it's you sort of know that driving force and that gives that momentum as to why the story is important and why you've got to pick it up.
Yes, I think I need to observe something first, whether it's an event, something happening, or someone across the street and the way they may be walking, or something that someone said, or I think I need just to see it, and from there that sort of sets off the imagination. I know that there are writers who don't need that, who dream up something in their heads. But I'm trying to do that. That's my next task, is to, okay, write a story that has nothing to do with anything you've experienced. So yeah, because
Go on, sorry.
People who know me will ask, well, okay, I think that may have happened, because it becomes a guessing game, because which parts of the story actually did you see or have happened, because people kind of know that I do that.
Yeah.
But
But
yeah.
I think that is true for I think that's true for all writers, really, that even though the idea might come out of nowhere, although I actually don't think that happens, but I think most of us do all of us take from real life and incorporate what we've seen around us and what we've experienced it, and sort of find a way to weave it into our fiction. And I think that's necessary, because then it gives it the sort of weight, and it grounds the story in something
Right.
real, that the reader can get a grip of as well. So it's
Right.
interesting that, yeah, because even stories, I think, that are set out in outer space and made up universes and worlds, the theme of the story, or the crux of the story, what's actually going on between the individuals in the story, I think does come from that writer's own experiences.
Right. Right. And that's why it sounds like that writer, because
Yeah.
what they choose to see in a scene is different from what another writer would see in the scene. So it's what you pick out that strikes you. Two people can experience the same, and take away from it quite differently,
Yeah.
and choose to write about different aspects of the same event or situation.
Yes, totally. And I guess you must have come across that quite a lot in your reporting days, because different channels will have different reporters who are picking up
Yes.
on different things, and it's the same event,
Yes.
but
Yes, exactly. And I always, in my head, I always told myself, get what the other guy isn't going to get. So you want the source to say something to you that he's not going to say to the other reporter, your competition, or you're going to find the angle that the other ones don't see. Um,
Mhm.
and that was always a goal of mine, to sort of, come at it a different way that would be not the usual, and therefore more interesting. Yeah.
Mhm.
And also, as a freelancer, you write for so many different publications, and each publication has its own readership. So you're writing for that particular reader. So there were times when I had one assignment for one publication, and while I'm reporting it, I'm thinking, if I go at it another way, I could write a second story about this for another publication. And so I would kind of interview the person twice, if necessary, to ask different questions for different. So, yeah.
Oh,
and,
that's
and so
really interesting.
yeah.
I didn't know that sort of thing happened. So that's really smart as well, being able to repurpose, maximize, make
Yes,
the most that you can of a good story.
exactly. Yes. And sometimes people will tell you things after that have nothing to do with the story that you've just talked about. And they might mention something personal or something, another part of their life. And your reporter brain is going, and you're thinking, oh, is that a story too? And that's happened. Interestingly, it happened for one of the best stories that I ever hit upon, happened that way. I was interviewing a guy for it was an airline magazine, and he had a business of his own, and he provided insurance for rock concerts. Okay, yeah. So I mean, that in and of itself wasn't very interesting to me. He was just a business guy. Afterwards, he tells me this story about how he was a bone marrow donor for a person in Germany, and this guy lived in Texas, and he went to Germany to meet the man, and they became friends. He was an older man, younger guy. Um, the older guy from Germany had never traveled in an airplane. He was from a eensy weensy little village in Germany. They became fast friends, and for years, and family friends. And so I wrote about that for the New York Times. And that piece was all over the world. It was picked up. The New York Times news service sent it everywhere because it had a global feel to it, and it was just a wonderful piece. So
Yeah. What a
never know
gorgeous
where.
story. Yeah.
Yeah.
And talking of gorgeous stories, we are here to talk about At the Seams, which is your debut novel. So tell us a little bit about it. Who is it about, and what's it about?
Yes. So it's the story of I guess you could say she's curious and a little bit obsessed, um, 8-year-old girl who is haunted by an experience that her grandparents had. They lost a baby mysteriously in the hospital in the 1930s. And she grows up to be a reporter who investigates this family secret that haunted her through childhood. Uh, and so it begins with her discovering it and how she discovered it and the unsettling feeling that stirred in her. And then she learns that her family has repressed this um, to protect the grandmother, feeling that to discuss it, to air it would upset her.
Mhm.
And so it was always under wraps, such that the rest of the family never thought of it. But only this character was riveted by it, and it affected her life. It sort of turned everything upside down, and it takes her through adolescence, and where she kind of figures out what to do about it. And along the way, she confronts, her family members who have different feelings about it. And the family practices to repress it. So she figures out how, when, if to break the cycle and to go against the family pattern, and and uh, and at what cost.
Yes, and at what cost? That's the sort of
Yes.
the big question. I found this intriguing because I was trying to think, gosh, because 8 years old is really young. And so I was very curious about what it was about this incident in her grandmother's life that intrigued her so much. Because it's not even her mother's life. So it's not even that she's lost, that there's this mysterious sibling who's never appeared, but actually a sort of much older relative. What was it for Katie that just really drew her in about the story?
Yes. So her mother, out of the blue, tells her this is about the situation, um, and she was very close with her grandparents and her grandmother. And I think finds that the way it was sort of just she felt ambushed by the information, I guess, and just the way it was thrown at her without any, as a matter of fact, this happened, um, just sort of unsettled her. She, it was close family. She knew her mother was an only child, and she has a brother. So the family dynamic is shifted for her,
Mhm.
and she feels this. She feels the shift. She feels something different, and she feels the very upsetting nature of the death. And this is also the fact that someone had died, and it was a baby who died, and at 8, that's a huge concept, really.
Mhm. Mhm. Yes, death seems such a strange thing for kids. My youngest two are 9 and 10, and that just seems such an alien concept that they could ever die or be
Right.
old enough. Or so yeah, it is a big theme.
Yes.
Um, and so it is fictionalized, but I understand that it is based on true events. So is this something that you discovered in your journalism life and have written about, or is it fact from your own life?
It's my family's story. Yes. My mother told me when I was about that age that she had a brother who died in the hospital. And so unlike Kate, I didn't become obsessed with the information, but it did sit with me. And
Hmm.
it was a curiosity, and it was something that was just there. It was in the undercurrent of our family, and I never broached the subject with my grandparents. And I would ask my parents from time to time about it. But it was just part of our family fabric. It was just something that happened in the past. And interestingly, when I, let's see, I'm trying to think about what year, but when I had my two daughters, um, let me think. It would be about when they were 3 and 5. I was divorced, and the first time that my daughters went to their father's house for the weekend, my younger one, and there's a scene in the book that this is written from truth, was became very upset and didn't want to go and was crying in the car, and it was a dreadful situation, and just wrenching, and she didn't understand what was happening. She was hysterical, and I was, at that moment, I began thinking about my mother's brother out of the blue. And I started, researching and trying to find out what was the story behind that. Now, granted, I was a reporter, but why did I all of a sudden think about that? So there is something subliminal in the idea of losing a child, and divorce will make you think that. That all of a sudden I began thinking about my mother's brother. And at that point, I did a lot of the research, and the research in the book is true. Everything that I found out about the baby was actually true and documented. And all of the details about the baby and about the situation and what happened, other than what I can surmise in the book, I surmise in real life. It's true. So I got to thinking, well, there is something about this loss that has been passed down or repeated or similar to what I experienced in my life with the divorce, that you start thinking about, the passing, the generational loss that's passed along. So I began thinking about my grandmother, and so at that point, I actually wrote an essay about it for the Huffington Post based on the information that I received. And from there, I thought, well, that was from a writing standpoint, that was enough for me at that point. And I let it sit. During the pandemic, after I was writing all of this fiction, I thought, I want to write something longer. How about a memoir about the baby? So I began this as a memoir, but could only get so far with the information that I could document. So I thought, well, let's turn it into fiction. And so that's sort of how this story came to be. But it really struck me. And then I went back. While I was thinking about during the pandemic, while I started to write it, I started thinking about the timing. And I hadn't realized that I first started to think about this as an adult at the time when I was initially divorced. And I didn't discover that until now. So at the time, I didn't realize there's this connection. I know why I'm looking up details about my grandmother's, life. I didn't know it at the time. I only knew it when I began writing the book. And when I looked at the dates of my initial inquiries to the New York State Board of, Records, I got the chills, because it was the same date that my daughters first, visited their dad. So.
Oh, isn't that spooky?
Yes. So, are these feelings embedded and passed down? Do they just trigger, something new? Who knows?
No,
exactly.
I'm very much, I didn't used to be. In fact, I say I didn't used to be. I'd never heard of the concept of generational loss or ancestral loss, and that we can carry the wounds of our ancestors with us. But the more I learn about people's lives, whether it be fiction or in life, I really do think that there is something that carries down with us, and it does take somebody to recognize it and break that cycle if it's a negative one.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think those dates, that just shows there's something
Something.
going on.
Right. Right. Yes. Yes. So in the book, I wanted the grandmother to raise her daughter, which is Kate's mother, in a certain way because of the loss of the first child. You're going to raise your second one in a
Mhm.
protective way, in a very different way, and then that person is going to be a certain kind of mother to the her baby,
Yeah.
who's going to then be a certain kind of mother to her baby. So they're actually four generations of girls, women. Yeah.
Oh, just thinking about my own family, I can definitely see how my mother parented different to her mother, and I parent differently again to mine. And it's going to be
Uh-huh.
intriguing to see how my daughters, should they have children, decide that
Yes.
they
Yes.
parent. It's going to be
Yes.
interesting. Now, a question I get a lot from writers, particularly if they are writing memoir or they're writing creative nonfiction, is about, how truthful can you be? Not just with the facts of the events, but people worry about naming people.
Yeah.
Writers worry about being very specific, say about the time that something happened or where it happened, addresses, shops, restaurants that are maybe
Yeah.
pertinent to a story. Was that something that you worried about at all? And if you did, how did you reconcile that? What decisions did you come to about that? And I'm curious too, did you talk to your family before you wrote the article and then went on to fictionalize the story? And what was the sort of response that you got from them?
Yeah. So, having written so many essays for publication, I was used to writing personal information. Um, and I would make the decision about writing. If I write this story, I know I have to include X, Y, and Z. So then you make the decision, well, do I want to write this story? Because maybe you don't want to reveal X, Y, and Z. So once you think the story through and you realize what's necessary to tell it, and it's okay with you and whoever else is involved, um, then you go ahead and write the story. So there have been times that I've chosen not to write an essay, because of the impact it could have on someone else. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
um, I don't think I've ever asked permission of family. Um, and my two daughters, when they were little, they provide such a wealth of information. Little kids growing up, and when they were little, I was writing a lot for the New York Times. Had in their opinion section a column called the Opinionator, and they had a column that was all about animals called Menagerie, and it was basically all about the human-animal bond and connections. And so my daughter brought home a frog from the science fair, and they're the whole, Skip had a whole life, but and anyway, I wrote about my daughter and Skip the frog, and it appeared in the New York Times. And after that, every time I wrote a story, my daughter, please, am I in it? They always ask, am I in it? Am I in it? Um, you know, I have written stories about my divorce, and my ex-husband has shown up in it. That's proven to be difficult at times. Um, but since there were reported pieces, he had to be there. Uh, but you're careful. Put it that way. I mean, I wouldn't write a story that would put someone in a bad light. I would only write a story that would put me in a bad light.
Okay.
Um, um, because it's not, what is the point of that? There's a difference between writing an essay and writing a rant or a screed. And so it's all about knowing, well, what is the point for the reader? What am I trying to say here that's beyond the situation?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really telling distinction to make. This is it's a story about an event, it's not a rant. It's not a way of kind of getting revenge on somebody you didn't like or
No,
who you feel injured you.
no, absolutely not. No, no.
And so when it came to then writing the book and expanding on this, you know, because you're delving into the lives of your grandmother and your mother, so different generations, were they comfortable with that, or did they actually didn't mind either way, they were happy with it, or they were actually curious to know themselves and they wanted to find out the truth?
Yes, well, my grandparents are no longer here. So, and my when I first wrote the essay in the Huffington Post about Baby I discovered a lot of details that my mother didn't even know. At that time, I shared them with her, and she didn't know the baby's name, and because he only lived a very short time. He died in the hospital. He was a few days old, and so when I told her the name, she had a reaction to that, and um, so and she's still around, though she's suffering with memory issues. So I she knows I've written a book, but beyond that, it's she doesn't know much more about it. My brother, there's a brother in the book, and he knows. He was aware, but nothing beyond what I was kind of aware of at the time. Is that, oh yes, mom had a brother, but um, but yeah, in choosing the details, I wanted to include the real factual details, uh, because they were that was the story that made me want to write. Those were the facts that made me want to write the story. So they were important. And to change dates and times just for the sake of changing them, I mean, there was no need to do that. The characters are based on the true lives of my grandparents and my parents. They did the same things. They had the same jobs. My grandfather was a dressmaker, and fantastically, he was a pattern maker. So he actually made the patterns for the dresses, and the book, thematically is about, well, this pattern of secrecy. And so I thought, oh, I couldn't give him a better profession, right? So
Well, that's lovely. I think there's maybe another story there just about your grandfather and the pattern
yes,
making of that day.
yes.
Talking of which, you very cleverly at the seams covers multiple timelines. So we've got the 1930s, the 1960s, and then there's the early 2000s. So I'm curious about how you wrote the book. Did you, because everyone writes a little bit differently. I'm a very linear writer. I start at the beginning and I go through to the end, but I know others write in different ways. So I was curious about how you wrote it, and whether you sort of focused on one time period, one timeline at a time, or whether you kind of went between them.
Yeah. At first, I thought to write it in three parts, giving each part to each of the women. So I thought first to write about the grandmother. That was part one, and the second about the mother, and the third, Kate. But then it struck me that it was really Kate's story, and I wouldn't have been able to. It it didn't serve the action. It didn't serve her discovery, which and her confronting. So it really she became the character. So at that point, I thought to just work with it chronologically, from her chronological life. Um, and so it begins when she's in the 1960s and she's 8, and then we learn about the grandparents and their past, interwoven in that, and then she grows up to be an adult. So yeah, and something like this too, where it's sort of a coming of age for her. She grows up and figures out, what do I do with this information? that's evolving, and that requires maturation, and all of that points to a linear kind of treatment.
Yay.
Yeah.
Yay. Yeah, they'd say the coming of age, that's so true. And we do need to, and I think a lot of readers will really resonate with this, because I think all families have skeletons of one degree or another, and there's always revelations that come out. Either we discover them like Kate does as a child, or we discover them when someone passes on and there's a piece of paper found with some information, and we do need that time to reconcile how we cope with that change, because even if it's a small thing, it can just be enough of a shift to change how we view our history and the life that we've led and our place within our family, perhaps. And it's probably no matter what age you are, there's a coming of age with that and how we respond to secrecy.
Absolutely. Yes.
Really
And there's a secret later on that she learns about. So that when she's older, and of course she handles it differently because she's a different age. So
talking of which, so you're in Kate's head, or in her life at different times. How did you approach that? Writing somebody who's 8, someone who's 12, someone who's an adult. Was that fun to do, or was that quite challenging?
Yeah, it was really fun to do, and I think, writing the essays and writing, really help with that. And writing, I've written about my past. I've written about myself in the essays as a child. I've written a lot about my kids. And so it was really, fun to do. It was a bit of a challenge because you need to think, well, what would the 8-year-old see in this? In this situation, what would the 14-year-old see in this? And then as an adult, it's still the same person. So she's going to have the same sensibilities and the same powers of observation, but they're going to be more sophisticated. So,
and I guess, the reflections as that maturity happens, how she's reflecting on the same information and seeing that event differently as she grows up. And then, of course, as she becomes a mother as well, which changes a lot of us, I think, becoming parents. Yes.
And it's, and people ask me, well, what, if you could encapsulate the book, thematically, and what would that look like? And to me, it's about how we protect the people we love. And so the grandfather protects his wife from this tragic event, and the grandmother protects her daughter from any guilt associated with that, or having to know about that, or and then Kate ultimately protects her baby in the end. And so there's a lot of I think it's how a situation makes people respond.
You mentioned the grandfather there, and I think that was one of the things I liked about the book, is it touched, because we often think about a mother's loss when an infant dies, but actually it's as big for a father as for a mother, and that was touched on really, really nicely in the book, I think.
Thank you. And I had a grandfather who was like that. And so he did magic tricks, and he was he was a wizard with fabric, and super creative and sensitive. So I wanted to portray the character as my grandfather was in real life.
No, it was because you really did feel his sensitivity in it. I'm thinking of a scene where he was in a supermarket, and he thought he saw the nurse, and the sort of reaction about, what do I do with that? How do I handle that? And I think all of us would feel thrown by that. And what do we do, and how do we respond?
Right.
So, what a busy career and life you've got with your writing. There's so much going on, from the articles, the essays, the short stories, the novels. How do you, from a practical point of view, how do you sort of manage all of that are you someone who is able to work on one project in the morning and another project in the afternoon? Or do you spend maybe 1 week on a project and then move on to another one? Or or are you able to kind of work on several at one go? How does it work for you?
Yes. So since I earn my living as a writer, there's work that I do, you know, that's assigned. When I was writing the novel, it hadn't yet been sold, so that was, so I would apportion part of the day to that. Typically, I would write in the morning, and then I have my assignments, and then I have this. So I'm yeah, I'm so disciplined, really, and when you're a working writer, you don't have the choice. It's not, well, I have this other job and or I don't have a job, I'm just going to choose to write when I feel like it. For me, it's never been a feel like it. It's what I do. So, I'm up early. I'm very scheduled and very, regimented. My kids are grown now, so I don't have the school schedule to fit into, and I used to have the school schedule. That was quite different. So now, with extra time, I guess for me it's about knowing when to put the pen down, and to go outside and do something else. But in terms of projects, so now I'm thinking of the next, and so um, while I'm, marketing the book, I'm thinking, okay, the next. And so I kind of portion out the day. So book
Mhm.
stuff, a couple hours in the morning, and then assignments, and then next. And if next is creative, so I'm working on some stories for a collection, that I will work on in the morning, because and then in the afternoon, I seem to write best in those hours, later in the afternoon and early in the morning. So
So that's
yeah.
a couple of things there that are really standing out to me. You've very clearly you said, I'm a writer. I earn my living through my writing. I don't have the choice to say, oh, I feel like writing today, or I don't feel like writing. And I think that's a really important part of, for any writer, whether they're earning a living through it or not. If somebody
Mhm.
wants to take their novel or their
Right.
memoir seriously, and they really have a dream and have a vision that, yes, not only do I want to write a first draft, but I want to revise it, I want to publish it, or I want to find an agent, that
Mhm.
not waiting for the muse, but understanding you have a choice. You can choose to sit and write, or you can
Yes.
choose not to. That's really
Yes.
important. So
Yes.
I hope all our writers listening kind of hear that that's what
Yes.
it takes to be a professional writer. um I heard you say too, about it. It's about being disciplined and being regimented was the word that you use. And I know that won't fit for everybody, but I,
Right.
you've got your day job, which is still writing, but for others who also have their day job, we've got to balance that out for ourselves. Yes, we have our paid employment, but then we've got to have that rigor, that discipline to say, okay, now I get to do my fun writing, the stuff that I
Exactly.
want to do.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
I think I hope our listeners hear that too, that that's where the job of being a writer comes in, is what, even when you're a bit tired, you find a way of squeezing something out that
Mhm.
maybe you'll revise in the morning because you don't like it, but it's
Yes.
something.
Exactly. And I find too that if you schedule out the pieces of what you're going to do. So if you are writing query letters, if you're up to that, decide, well, I'm going to do that on Thursday at 2 o'clock, and just write it down, Thursday at 2 o'clock. And then you're going to do it then. And there isn't a question about it. You just, Thursday comes around, and you do it. So if you chart everything out, it doesn't, for me anyway, it doesn't take away any of the creativity.
Mhm.
The minute you start writing, your brain jumps into that creative mode, and whether you schedule out your time doesn't really affect the actual writing. At least doesn't for me. I
Well,
think I think a lot of people worry, well, if I'm too organized or I'm too rigid, it'll affect the creative process. But when you're writing, you're writing, and something else takes over. Whether you've written it down in your calendar that you're going to do it at that moment really has no effect.
yes. It's so true. Once your brain clicks into mode,
Yes.
then you're off. You're making me think of I've recently been reading Twyla Tharp's book, A Creative
Oh,
Habit.
yeah. I named a dog after Twyla Tharp.
That is a good name for a dog. Don't tell her I said that.
Yeah.
But again, yeah, she argues for the point very convincingly, I think, that creativity is a habit. And I agree with that too, and that the longer you break the habit, the harder it becomes. And so once you do create it, you kick your brain into gear and it does what it
Yes.
needs to do. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So for those who are listening and might, particularly for our journalist listeners out there, because I've spoken to a lot of journalists who they're very, very confident when it comes to their nonfiction and the articles and the pieces that they've got to produce. But when I talk to them about their own fiction, you can see it physically. There's this like, oh, I'm scared. I don't want to do it. I possibly don't even want to talk about it. But you've made that lovely transition. And so for anyone out there who's listening and feeling nervous about doing it themselves, what words of wisdom would you have for them?
Yes. Well, it's if you write feature stories, you're a step closer to writing fiction than if you cover breaking news, or if you write hard news. As a feature writer, you're trained to look for the anecdotes, the scenes, the settings, the more descriptive parts of a news story. Uh, I think for me anyway, it's a little, you're so, as a journalist, you're trained to just latch on to the facts, and it's only facts, and you can't entertain anything else. The what if is only, it comes into play when you're interviewing somebody. But the what if doesn't happen with the facts of the story. So at first for me, I kept returning to, and particularly since this story was based on a true story, I kept being magnetically pulled to the truth of it. And so I would tell myself, no, it doesn't have to happen that way. It doesn't have to. You can change it. And so I consciously changed, embellished, switched, um, uh, settings, switched some of the concrete stuff so that I would train myself to invent more.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there are things you can do consciously, but it's a hard switch. It's a hard switch when your job is to tell the truth, and
Mm-hmm.
only the truth, um, as
So
a
it sounds
reporter.
like um, you're sounds like taking those baby steps between non-fiction to full fiction is actually still embed yourself in truth, but then embellish, and then that
Yes,
kind of has that sort of safety factor in it that you're
yes, yes.
still writing about something that you know to be true, and then you can let that creative side sort of come out, or that more imaginative side come out.
Right, right. So if you start with something true, and then the next place you go with it is not true, and then the place you go after that is not true, then I guess the goal is, well, start with something true and see how much you can invent after that.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens is, and a bit of reality sprinkles back in later on, so it becomes this web of you know it becomes a big mess. And sometimes I would think to myself now, if I think about the book, I would think, well, did that happen? I have to ask myself, did it or didn't it happen? Because when you write a story, as you it becomes real in your head.
Mm-hmm.
You live what the characters live as you write. And so sometimes I just throw up my hands. I don't know if it was true or not true, but that's the story.
And that's it, and that's what makes it become a unique piece of storytelling, whether or not it's true or not. It's unique,
Yeah,
and then it's
yeah,
yours.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So you did touch on it briefly earlier. I should say thank you very much for that. I think that's really good advice for our non-fiction writers out there. But you touched briefly earlier on what you're working on now. You said you're looking to put together an anthology, is that right?
Yes, a story collection. So it's going to include several that have been published, and then about 2/3 that haven't. And they all have to do with women characters um, who deal with what women deal with, and figure out how to move on from it. So I guess they're the ways that they encounter obstacles or challenges or hurt or and the working title is "And Then You Apply Ice," meaning you.
I love
Yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah,
So true, but also funny. I like that.
yeah, yeah. So I have 2 stories left. So in terms of structuring the day, I have a Google Doc set up with just the title of the next one, which I've figured out in my head what the story is going to be. So it's waiting there. This open, empty document is waiting for me to finish. So
Fill it with magic. That's
yeah,
lovely. Exciting. We don't know what's going to come. That's exciting. Yeah.
right, right.
So At the Seams is available. And where is the best place for our listeners to find out about it and find out more about you?
Well, I have a website with my name, PamelaGwynKripke.com, and everything is on there. Instagram too, where you can buy the book or what else you would like to know.
Fantastic. Well, I will be sure to link to those absolutely in the description. Pamela, it's been a joy speaking to you. Thank you for sharing about your experiences, about taking something real, fictionalizing it, making that transition from nonfiction to fiction, and what it takes to be a working writer. I think we all need to be reminded of that every now and again. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.